It's a great honour to be invited to give a talk to this international seminar on gentrification. Hello everybody, I wish you well. I'm going to talk about planetary gentrifications and how to address them. And I'm going to begin with a proclamation made by Neil Smith in 2002 that gentrification had gone global. Gentrification was now generalised. Gentrification was the leading edge of neoliberal urban policy worldwide. Now, of course, there was kind of very little work before this date really looking at gentrification internationally. So I teamed up with Ernesto Lopez Morales at the University of Chile and Hum Bang Shin, who's at the London School of Economics, to kind of bang our heads together and get thinking about this. Was there really such a thing as a global gentrification, or was it really just a global north process? We applied for an Urban Studies Foundation grant and then did a series of networking events and research and other things that resulted in our own kind of ideas about this. Now, one of the first things that we did is go back to Ruth Glass's work. Ruth Glass, of course, famously coined the term gentrification in 1964, but there's lots of other work of hers that has never been read. And there were two things that really struck us in that same 1964 text. She said, what happens to the elaborate theories and speculations on the trends and implications of urbanisation on the international scale when it has to be admitted that even the most elementary raw material for their verification exists? And of course, we were struck that there wasn't actually a great deal of evidence underpinning these claims for a global gentrification. Secondly, she was concerned about the persistence of the Western ideology of urbanism, or rather anti-urbanism. And again, we wondered, is it appropriate to look through a global north theoretical lens to look at gentrification globally? Now, after years of work and networking, etc., we came together and we finally wrote the book Planetary Gentrification. In this book, we take on board the new comparative urbanism, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We revisit the concept of the urban and the process of urbanisation at multiple scales. And we also try critically to advance post-colonial geographies. So the book does, I guess, four things. Firstly, it narrates planetary gentrifications, and that's plural, and configurations between their paths, focusing on the ascendancy of the secondary circuit of real estate, which is really paramount. Secondly, it acknowledges other post-colonialisms, both old and new. It demonstrates planetary indigeneity, organic gentrifications that are not copies of those in the West. And finally, it problematises translations, and this is really important, translations west to east, north to south, and vice versa. Now, it's important to say that our new comparative urbanism is not quite the same as development geographers like Sue Parnell or Jenny Robinson. For new comparative urbanists coming from development geography, it's the injustice of neglect and misrecognition of certain southern or third world cities. But for us, as critical political economists, it was that plus the injustice of accumulation by dispossession and class exploitation. We wanted to do more than transcend the oppression based on location, but of human beings being socially cleansed out of cities worldwide. So our gentrification theory then is both located, but it's also dislocated. It looks at the structural core of gentrification, or universal conditions of possibility, enabling conditions like societal regime shift and the associated restructuring of cities, rent formation, increase and capture. We look at the production of gentrifiers and gentrifiable areas, and class displacement or replacement. There are contingent, conjunctural or necessary factors, we argue, that determine gentrification's actual presence, form and possibilities, accounting for variations in geographies and temporalities. And of course, John Betancourt in 2014 argued that both the enabling and necessary factors have to concur at a critical scale and be brought together by social actors who turn the potential into actually existing gentrification. Now, of course, as critical political economists, we were wary of taking Western ideas on critical political economy outside of the global north. But we were struck by Ananya Roy, who said This is not to say that this analysis, e.g. critical political economy, is not applicable to cities of the Global South. Indeed, it's highly relevant. And of course, cities in the Global South are part and parcel of global capitalist circuits. We also draw heavily on the geographer Doreen Massey, who says, interdependence of all places and uniqueness of individual places can be understood as sides of the same coin, in which two fundamental geographical concepts, uneven development and the identity of place, can be held in tension with each other and can each contribute to the explanation of the other. So approaching planetary gentrification, we had to think hard about this. One, it's not simply about starting in the Global South, or turning around the telescope to look from non-usual contexts, or ignoring the usual suspects and doing comparative urbanism without the West. The key lies more in placing cities on a level analytical plane in comparative studies. Of course, the mobility and circulation of urban policy remains an important focus. And third, more comprehensive and multi-regional comparison is only possible, we would still argue, through multicultural research teams and networks of researchers. We learned big time from each other, between the three of us, and from other people. Of course, in the Planetary Gentrification book, we have a table that shows the differences between the more traditional comparative approaches in gentrification studies and the relational comparative approach that we undertook. And I'm not going to read them all out, but there are some notable differences. For example, we see the city as unbounded in comparison to the traditional way, which was to see the city as bounded. We see the city as constituted through relationships, flows and networks with other places, etc., etc. Our theory building, both in the book and even still now, is much more tentative and evolving. It's not static, whereas the theory building traditionally in gentrification studies has been quite certain. What we do is we answer other critical political economists' call for a reloaded urban studies. So, for example, Andy Merrifield, the removal of centre-periphery binary thinking, acknowledging the emergence of multiple centralities across urbanising spaces and dispensing with all the old chestnuts between global north and global south, between developed and underdeveloped worlds, between urban and rural, between urban and regional, between city and suburb. Just as we need to dispense with all distinctions between public and private, state and economy, and politics and technocracy. Of course, this kind of work builds on Henri Lefebvre's work on the final frontier, the complete urbanisation of society, which we feel is very well underway, or what Brenner and Schmidt call the totalisation of capital. So that's a kind of summary of planetary gentrifications in a nutshell. Now I want to talk about how to address planetary gentrifications, and I would put three keys on the table. One is resistance, the second survivability, and the third is alternatives. Of course, the literature on resistance in gentrification studies goes way back to Chester Hartman's work in the 1970s and 1980s, and indeed work on resistance to gentrification seems to be back in vogue again today. However, I'd argue that urban scholars have sought to busily conceptualise the right to the city, the right to stay put, but they've spent much less energy on conceptualising the actual fight to stay put in the face of gentrification. And that fight is critical, and it's critical now more than ever before. Of course, in my own work as a scholar activist, I've been involved in this fight, and in 2015 I was involved in a public inquiry into the demolition of one of the largest public housing estates in Europe and its complete gentrification. And we got lucky with the help of lawyers and kind of pushing back over human rights violations and using equalities law. We actually won that case in 2016, and the council was not allowed to demolish the estate. Of course, this is an ongoing story and I won't go into it now, but I want to just kind of put on the table here that you can have wins, and you can have really significant wins, and I was very proud to be involved in this. But survivability is something I'm really interested in, because surviving gentrification is critical for anybody who's been impacted by it. This is a critical concept, I think, that holds real promise for a properly global or planetary gentrification studies. The value of survivability as a practice of resistance. The fact that survivability is constantly negotiated in and through informality, invisibility, temporalities, and the limits to solidarity. The concept of survivability introduces a welcome perspective of individual action into the field of gentrification studies, which has perhaps tended to make assumptions about the collective nature of resistance. We think of resistance when we think of Gezi in Istanbul, or Tompkins Square Park in the Lower East Side in New York City. We think less about individual acts of resistance, which are also equally important. In reality, planetary resistance to gentrification is composed of both overt opposition and everyday, often invisible resistances, which are entangled and in a constant process of becoming. A neo-Marxist reading of gentrification and resistance to it that harnesses the power of Marxist analysis at the same time as enabling the epistemic authority that comes out of marginalised people's everyday lives is something I would like to put on the table. And I've done this with Sandra Annunciata, who I think hopefully is there somewhere in the audience, and Clara Rivas Alonso in our recent paper in Annals of the Association of American Geographers. Of course, survivability is different in different places. The bottom image shows people being pushed out of council estates in London. The bottom image on the right shows slum dwellers in Lagos, Nigeria, being pushed out as their slums were demolished. The top right image shows Vila Outrodoma in Brazil, and of course you guys should know about that. And then also the image on the top left, for me, is about thinking about people who are surviving, living in the middle of processes of gentrification. They haven't necessarily yet been pushed out, but they're confronted with it on a daily basis. And I think this is really critical because there's a difference between in situ displacement and kind of physical displacement. And there are kind of emotional geographies and health and other public health issues that kind of come with this. But what about alternatives? Alternative models of inclusive urban development must include three key factors, I would argue: affordability, accessibility, and diversity. Affordability relates to cost of living, income, and economic opportunity. Accessibility refers to transport, public space, goods and services, political participation, freedom to move through space or hang out, and access for varying abilities and opportunities. Diversity. This means the full scope of races, ethnicities, cultures, ages, religions, sexualities, political views, choice. Inclusive growth can only be achieved by rejecting the planetary gentrification model and developing models of inclusive development. And of course there are lots of examples of alternatives. One of the ones that seems to be creeping to the top of the table at the moment is community land trusts, whereby land and property is taken out of the speculative market. It's taken out of the capitalist speculative market, and it enables affordability, particularly for low-income groups. There are lots of other examples. I could talk about co-ops, etc., but I don't have time today. But what's particularly interesting for me is that anti-gentrification policies and practices are emerging at the moment, and ironically the United States of all places is leading the way. So to give you a flavour of some examples, Portland in Oregon, for example, the Housing Bureau's preference policy or right to return is the first of its kind in the United States. This programme gives down payment assistance to first-time homeowners who are displaced or at risk of displacement from the city's north and northeast neighbourhoods because of urban renewal. The city plan now delegates how $20 million will be spent on affordable housing, and they claim that this is an effort to, quote, atone for the sins of gentrification. This is pretty significant. In Milwaukee, the Department of City Development's anti-displacement plan is there to prevent Milwaukee's residents around the city's developing downtown from being displaced. In San Francisco in 2016, their anti-displacement policy, supported by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, now gives first dibs on affordable housing units in the city's Mission District to those heavily affected by gentrification. Even in Atlanta, in an effort to prevent hardships on low-income property owners due to redevelopment, the City of Atlanta has created an anti-displacement tax fund programme, the first of its kind, an initiative which will pay any property tax increases for qualifying homeowners. This is really significant stuff. In Europe, much of the policy making has been about stalling investors, particularly international investors. So, for example, Berlin, which is rapidly gentrifying, the inner city borough of Friedrichshain-Kreuzberg announced that it would not allow a privately owned tenement to be sold to an international investor. Instead, the officials directed the sale towards a state-owned independent housing association committed to affordable rents. The Milchschutz, or neighbourhood protection laws, a ban on luxury renovations, the intent being to retain social mix in gentrifying areas and to prevent swift transformations, rapid gentrification that can break up communities. Paris has instigated laws designed to inhibit economic ghettoisation in its inner city by demanding right of first refusal to properties in a number of wealthy districts where public housing levels are especially low. Even in London recently, the mayor has said that new developments must now first be offered to local buyers. So, my argument quite clearly here is that we need to be thinking about planetary urban futures under conditions of gentrification. And importantly, we need to try to do something about it. If we're going to write about gentrification, we have a moral obligation to do something about it as academics, as scholar activists. And I want to leave you with a video that's related to a guest essay that myself and my postdoc Stefano Portilli wrote recently in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. And this is a clip of displacement due to gentrification in the neighbourhood of Douawasti in Casablanca, Morocco. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope you have a great seminar, a great conference. Thank you.